Hello again and welcome back. The last time we were together, we tried to set out a start point for our exploratory journey through worship by trying to consider a working definition of what worship actually was. The suggestion that I offered was that worship is the response from the heart from being in the presence of God. I explained that I didn't expect us all to accept that blindly, but to go away and maybe think about it and work out why we didn't accept it. But at least it gave us a shared vocabulary for our time together and a starting point for our explanation. Today, I plan to go beyond that and look at how that start point might engage with what we may have in the past assumed worship to be. If, before we'd made a definition, I had asked the question, what is worship? I guess the responses would have been very varied, but here are some that I have received from past discussions with people. Worship is singing the glory of God. It's a conversation with God, or even the use of liturgy to give God his rightful place. And there are many other examples of the responses that I have received that I could tell you about, but each one has the same failing when measured against our definition. They all talk about things, about songs, about prayer, about liturgy, music, even clothing, as being worship. Things that may be done in the presence of God, rather than looking at the initiating event, the response from the heart. These things that we do are not worship of themselves. Worship originates in the heart and may spill out into action, but it is foremost an attitude of heart. From the heart, it may burst out and come to fruition through an act of worship, through song, through prayer. And we will certainly consider those things more when we think of Jesus' words to the woman at the well, where he spoke about true worshippers worshipping the Father in spirit and in truth. And we'll consider that another time. But for now, let's think about it in this way. If a carpenter comes to your house to build a table or to repair a door, remembering that the carpenter is skilled in carpentry, the carpenter will come along and lay their tools out on a bench or on the floor, and the tools might be a hammer, a saw, a set of screwdrivers or chisels, set squares, levels, and all other kinds of implements. Now, none of those things are carpentry. They are tools which enable the carpenter to do the carpentry. And out of the skill and the imagination of the carpenter, they create a masterpiece of carpentry. Just like us worshippers, we sing, we pray, we recite liturgy, we offer responses, but none of these things are worship. Like the carpenter and their tools, they are the things that we might use to produce and express worship, but they themselves are not worship. Song is no more worship than a chisel is carpentry. They're both tools. They're both the means to the end. And in the same way, the carpentry comes from within the carpenter. It is a mixture of imagination and skill and experience. Worship comes from within the worshipper. Remember our definition? The response from the heart to being in the presence of God. And one of the first lessons that we can explore about worship is to begin to recognise the distinction between worship and the tools that we might use to worship. For if we don't appreciate the difference, we may find ourselves great practitioners at using the tools. We will craft beautiful services. We will write and sing moving songs. We will conduct choirs of melodious voices, and yet not worship. For worship happens within the heart. It is in a time like this, where all our usual tools are denied us, that we find out whether we are genuinely users of tools or worshippers. Over the years, when I've spoken to many on the subject of engaging with the church, I often have the response thrown back at me, "What? Church? I don't need church. I can worship anywhere." And of course, within our working definition, that is true. For if worship comes from the heart's response to God's presence, and God is everywhere, then of course we can worship him anywhere. But now we have had our tools removed from us, our buildings and our choirs, our organs, our music bands, our light shows, our overhead projectors. And now we sit in the solitude and the quiet and the peaceful surroundings of our homes. Are we able to worship without these familiar tools? If not, there is a very difficult question to ask of ourselves. Have we ever learned to worship at all? And that is a tough question. A swimming instructor once told me that to learn to swim, it is best never to use water wings or flotation aids, because when they are taken away, the learner realises that they have never really learned to swim. And the realisation usually comes just as they sink, spluttering below the surface of the water. We have a wonderful picture of our grandson in our home. He was about 2.5 when the picture was taken, and it is a picture of him swimming underwater with his eyes wide with excitement and his mouth pulled back in this wonderful grin of joy. And there's not a buoyancy aid in sight. Have we learned to worship in the same exuberant way as our grandson has learned to swim and to swim underwater? And therefore know the joy and the vibrancy of worshipping him in our own living rooms, just him and us, with all else stripped away? Or do we find that without the tools, without the buoyancy aids that we have used down through the years, that we find ourselves lost and floundering, looking desperately for another set of tools to replace what we no longer have at this time? That is an uncomfortable position to be in. And I recognise that it is an uncomfortable question to ask of ourselves. And if we do feel disoriented in our worship in this way, dare we ask why it is that we feel like this? For example, we might ask, what do we expect from worship? Do we expect comfort and blessing, healing, a sense of meeting with God, an overwhelming sense of knowing peace? Now, I have no doubts that a product of worship is that we will experience all these things. But if they are the reason we come to worship, our priorities appear to be a little skewed. Surely our worship should be measured by what he receives rather than what we take from it. I can remember as a very young, very enthusiastic Christian, and it worries me to think that I have to go back 40 years to remember this. I once left a large charismatic church gathering on an incredible high. I was floating 2 or 3 inches above the ground, just utterly enthralled by the experience I just had in the worship service. I remember speaking to a friend that I was walking home with, saying something like, "Wasn't that incredible? I was so blessed by the worship tonight." And as the words came out of my mouth, I was astonished to hear what was to become a familiar voice deep within saying something like this: "I'm so glad you enjoyed my worship. What do you think I thought about it?" And I was so taken aback by this observation, if you like, by this question that had certainly come from God. I was so taken aback that I was silent for the rest of the journey home, as I struggled with this thought that God might have anything to say about the worship that I and hundreds of others had just brought to him. Although with the benefit of hindsight, I always hope that the Father in his grace would joyfully receive any worship that we would offer him. But that occasion, nearly 40 years ago, made me wonder then, and still occasionally now, whether our understanding of why we worship needs to be examined. If we genuinely come to worship him as our focus, what right do we have to expect anything back? Using our definition, we are in the presence of God, and therefore will receive all kinds of blessing. But that should not be our motivation to worship him. Let's test ourselves just for a moment. If we were to go to a service in church, any church, and we worshipped, and we left afterwards feeling no sense of blessing, no sense of comfort or presence, would we continue and go back the next week and go through all that again? If not, then the question is, who was the worship for? Was the worship for our benefit? And if we received no benefit, then not returning to give God his due? Or was the worship for him? And was the worship unconditional from our hearts? Maybe we need to reconsider our heart focus in our worship. Do we worship him because it is first and foremost his due and his right? After all, if we don't worship, even the stones will cry out in praise. Do we worship in order to bless and to bring joy to the Father's heart? Or do we have another, more personal motivation? I said at the start of our exploration yesterday that we had no hope of getting all of the answers. And staying true to that spirit, I don't have the answers to those questions. But I do hope that we have begun to answer the right questions that we can search through for ourselves. And I'll leave you with these thoughts to consider before we meet again. For next time, we will consider further the character of worship and the words of Jesus to the woman at the well when he spoke about the true worshippers and worshipping in spirit and in truth. But for now, may God go with you.